My name is Matthew Hora, and I'm the director of the Center for Research on College to Workforce Transitions. And thank you for coming to the first lecture in our spring 2018 seminar series. So one of the goals of our center is to spark conversation about issues related to the transition between college and the workforce, particularly from a multidisciplinary perspective. And so that's one of many reasons I'm very excited to host Vanessa Sansonne from University of Texas, San Antonio. She has a background in sociology and demography, which you'll see evident in some of her work. Dr. Sansonne is an assistant professor of higher education in the Department of Ed Leadership and Policy Studies at UT San Antonio, her hometown. Dr. Sansonne's research agenda is focused on college affordability, Latino, Latina students, student veterans, and Hispanic serving institutions. She also studies college students' experiences with career decision-making in the world of work, which is a topic we'll hear about in this morning's talk. So can you all please join me in welcoming Dr. Vanessa Sansonne all the way from Texas.
Thank you very much for having me today. First, I want to thank Dr. Matt Hora and the Center for Workforce Transitions here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm very excited to be here. As I was mentioning a minute ago, this is my first time not only to Madison, Wisconsin, but to the Midwest. So I'm learning so much about this wonderful place. And honestly, I mentioned on social media, I think it's becoming my second home. So we'll see. So thank you. So the title of my presentation today is called Reframing Labor, How Evolving Work Experiences Influence Student Success. And as Dr. Hora mentioned a minute ago, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And where I teach and also where I'm from, given that I am a sociologist with sociological lenses, will really shape the discussion that I talk about today. And just to kind of set this up, the talk will focus on this area of research, but I'm going to use a published study that Dr. Anne-Marie Nunez and I from The Ohio State University, she's an associate professor there in the Department of Education Studies. We worked on this together. And so I also want to just mention her for a moment and also thank her for collaborating on this work that we continue to push. And this piece that I will begin with too is also published in the Review of Higher Education. So the first slide that I have for you here is this very intriguing map, I hope. It's done by the Economic Innovation Group, which is an economist think tank that focuses on spatial inequity in various settings. And every year they come out with equity indices that take into account such things as degree attainment, home ownership, also additional poverty indicators that they've created. And based on this indices, they look at major cities throughout the United States. And then once they look at major cities, they look at these indices by zip code. And so what you're looking at here is the map of the city of San Antonio, Texas. And it's based on their spatial inequity. And so when I look at this, basically what I'm seeing in terms of that is this idea of inequity where half of the city is high in terms of not being distressed, or high in being most distressed and low in being distressed. And so you have this bar here that gives you that representation of those equity indices. So again, green means you're fine, red means there's a lot of inequity happening in terms of all these poverty indices. And so looking at this by zip code then, we can see in one of the zip codes of the green areas, which is zip code 78258, you can see some of the distress scores, which is very low. But again, looking at those poverty indicators, not very high on some of them. But take a look then at zip code 78207, which is that bright red area of this map. And we can see very high measures of distress. So interesting enough, the city of San Antonio is actually ranked as one of the highest spatially unequal cities in the United States. And that goes beyond cities like Atlanta, goes beyond cities that I think you would think that, what, San Antonio, but it really is playing into everything that we do in this city. And so how does this work in terms of education? So the city of San Antonio, where not only I'm from, but where this idea generated from in terms of looking at work, is really tied to the economic opportunities available. So if you don't know, let me just give you a couple of things about the city. But we are the 7th largest city in the United States. We are a majority minority city. And what that means is the demographic population in San Antonio is 63% more or less Latina, Latino, which is a lot. We also are known as Military City USA. So a lot of the bases around the city of San Antonio, we have a number of them. For those of you who have any ties to the Air Force, you probably came through the city of San Antonio for basic training, because we are the gateway to the Air Force, which is why it's actually a title that we hold very near and dear, calling ourselves Military City USA. Around San Antonio, though, we also have a number of universities. So in terms of geography of opportunity, which is something William Tate, as well as Nick Hillman here at the University of Wisconsin takes a look at, we actually have quite a bit of universities. However, many of them are private. The University of Texas at San Antonio actually is a young university, established in 1969. We just, not that long ago, I think maybe getting between 15 and 20 years, have our second public four-year university, which is the University of Texas A&M San Antonio. And that just opened. So the big contributor to pathway and education in this city is actually our very large community college system, which is Alamo Community College District. And it includes 5 large community colleges. So we do have opportunity, but again, thinking about that map again. That way, sorry. Who has access to this opportunity when we're talking about the economics? And again, thinking about ideas within college associated with college affordability and cost, right? So cost beyond tuition and fees. So where does this go with this idea of working? It actually plays in a lot to it. So at the University of Texas at San Antonio, the population that we serve mirrors what I just mentioned. So we have a large Latino student population. With that, there are also a large population who tend to have a high need. So about 60 to 70% of our undergraduate students receive some form of financial aid. And again, with the rising costs of college tuition in the United States, we know that that Pell Grant isn't actually, even if you receive full, it's not stretching in terms of actually affording college. So what are students doing? A lot of them are working. And when we looked at this work, Anne-Marie Nunez and I looked at this in terms of how does work play into this, we began to turn our attention for a minute beyond this idea of Latinos, and just turn our attention to the work literature in higher education. And so what do we know about working college students? The first thing that we know from the research, and this is actually, this number here comes from the Georgetown Center for Work and Education, but we know that undergraduates in the US, regardless of background, that 70% are working some sort of employment. That's a large percentage of our students. And interesting enough, we actually don't know how this is playing into their success. And again, I want to just remind you beyond ethnicity and class for a minute. So Anne-Marie and I began to look at the literature to see exactly what do we know. And what we began to find out, looking over here, is this idea of work and student outcomes. So we've known for many, many years that work is a factor associated with student success. But when you actually dig into the research, the way that student outcomes have been operationalized in this literature varies. So student outcomes has been operationalized, for example, not just in terms of persisting from term to term, but in terms of GPA, in terms of cognitive ability. And so that's really interesting in and of itself, because it's like, okay, well, I mean, how is it actually associated with student outcomes? The other thing that we found out was that most of this literature, and it's extensive, by the way, it's exhaustive. It's a whole list of it, but it's primarily quantitative. And that was really interesting. That was something that I actually didn't expect to find. Most of it, then again, if we're talking about quantitative assessments and looking at this, again, we're gonna have to talk about operationalization of variables. And so how is work operationalized? Interesting enough, again, even when we're looking at these wonderful statistical models that are measuring student success and how work is associated with that, we start seeing that work is being operationalized in various ways again. So a lot of times it's being operationalized in terms of how many hours per week a student is working, and that can vary. So we see sometimes it's a binary variable of 10 hours a week, more than 10 hours a week. That could also be upped up to 40 hours a week or less. And then we also see in terms of location, where was work actually happening? Was it on campus? Was it off campus? That was another thing that we found out. And then with type, that was one thing too that we began to see that there could be a pattern in terms of type, but very few studies have looked at and distinguished type. So an example of what I'm talking about when I say type is work study, right? That's a type of work. But could it also be work in other ways? Because we know that working doesn't just have to fit in these buckets here. Think of, for example, the college student who's a single mother. Taking care of kids, that's a job. But it's not necessarily captured in the way that we're thinking about work and the way that we're quantifying work. And again, I want to go back to the students that we serve in this region. Those kind of characteristics are very important to researchers like myself and Anne-Marie Nunez. So needless to say, very few studies have looked at work in terms of qualitative approaches. And so really understanding how students make meaning of work and how they feel it is or is not associated with their success in college, that's a big gap in the literature. And of course, beyond that, very few studies have looked at underrepresented students in terms of work. So now bringing our attention to Latina, Latino college students who work. When we began to look at the literature on that, just demographic research, this box right here is actually coming from the Excelencia in Education. So Deborah Santiago's group there in Washington, DC. Well, they began to start looking at Latino students just in terms of how they afford college. And what they began to see is that more or less 40% of all full-time 16 to 24-year-old Latino college students are working while enrolled in college. And when you think about that, when we're disaggregating by ethnicity, that's a lot. That's a lot of students who are working while enrolled in college. Now again, it's just, we don't know how this is influencing, but when we go to the literature on Latino college students, but also Latino college students who work, we see that when we compare them to other racial and ethnic backgrounds, Latinas and Latinos are more likely to work for pay. They also are more likely to report financial concerns. And they also have financial responsibilities beyond paying tuition and fees. And I want to take a moment to talk about that particular bullet point right there. So culturally speaking, we begin to, sometimes we forget to include the cultural components of underrepresented students. And what we see in terms of Latino student success is that culturally speaking, family is very important to their success. And if you study this particular group in terms of a sociological or anthropological lens, you'll find that family is very important, the familial unit. And one of the reasons why the familial unit is so important to Latinos is because Latinos as a minoritized group in the US has struggled economically. they are actually, they have yet to recover from the 2008 recession, compared that to other racial and ethnic backgrounds who have. And so if that gap keeps rising, one of the ways that they tend to go beyond these economic barriers that they faced in the US is they tend to rely on the familial unit. And so what does that mean for a Latina, Latino college student? A good example is that they tend to have to support their family, even if they're on full rides at a university. They still have some sort of financial responsibility back home. And that's, I think, I wanted to just take a few moments with that. And by the way, and there's nothing wrong with that too, to them. That's the way it is, and that's okay. The other thing too, in terms of just general Latino student success, is we know that Latinas and Latinos tend to also be first-generation college students. And then in terms of the numbers, they also have lower rates of college attainment. So as Anne-Marie and I began to reflect a little bit on this literature, we began to think of this in terms of labor. And so this slide right here is kind of giving you how we thought about these things. And so it really began with, okay, if there is a need to work, we also must think of institutional capacity. And I think that's really important to think about, because institutional capacity, depending on where the student ends up at, will really dictate this whole thing about work. So I probably actually should put an arrow going back and forth, because using my home institution, the University of Texas at San Antonio, we are not a flagship institution. We were created to serve a region, and in particular, we were created to serve an underrepresented population that tends to struggle with paying for college. So another way of saying that, an affordable college education. And so we may not necessarily meet the static metrics that define institutional success, like a 4-year graduation rate. So that may play out in terms of what we can afford to fund. Can we afford to just allow, give everybody a full ride to the University of Texas at San Antonio? Not necessarily, no. I know we would love to, but the capacity that we have is very limited. Think here at the wonderful University of Wisconsin-Madison, that is the flagship. Maybe they have more opportunity to assist with this idea of paying for work. They may also have more ties to the work community, where they can create more internships and also work opportunities. I think also another school to think about, or a way of thinking about institutional capacity, is in the state of California. You have the UC system and for example, like a UC Merced versus a UCLA. Two different types of funding that we got going on, and opportunity, right? So going on with this way of thinking about it though, we brought into this way of reframing labor with the idea of habitus. And habitus is from theoretical framework from Pierre Bourdieu, who's a sociologist. And habitus, the way that I think about habitus, is how does your socialization influence the way that you make meaning of things, but also the way that you act? And so how does this need to work? Institutional capacity, as well as the way that you are socialized and influence in the way that you act. Could it have some form of learning in there? And that's kind of the question that we had as we were moving forward with this particular study. So I want to kind of go through this conceptual framework of reframing labor. So as I mentioned, Pierre Bourdieu, in particular, what we looked at is that habitus, but also capitals, right? Because a lot of the work, we also want to make sure that we understand non-dominant forms of capitals if we're going to start looking at underrepresented students. And what is that? Non-dominant forms of capital. That's other ways of thinking about assets that students bring that tend to not be seen as valuable to others. So that actually comes from Prudence Carter. That also comes from the work of Tara Yoso and Danny Solosano, and thinking about forms of capital. So a good idea on this idea of non-dominant forms of capital, again, is tying back to what I mentioned about family. The familial unit could be a form of capital in terms of support that tends to be seen as a deficit in most cases the way that we think about higher education and student success, right? Here's an example of a deficit mentality with that. This idea of like helicopter parents, right? And so usually that's seen as a negative, but could it be actually for students like Latinos a form of capital that we can take advantage of and help them in terms of student success? The other thing we looked at was the work of Brian Pusser, who conceptualized this idea of work as a form of learning. And his area of research is actually looking at adult learners who were working in the community college system and how they were able to gain skill development in their work position at the community college. And so taking these three things here, we began to use that and guide us to the study that I mentioned at the beginning, which very thankful, again, published in the Review of Higher Education. But this is the question that we began to ask ourselves. And how does a group of first-generation Latina, Latino students describe how working influences their college experiences? So that is the research question that we answered in that particular publication. So let me tell you a little bit about that study in terms of the methods that we did. And so focusing on the sample, it's going to be very important that I note that this is a qualitative study. And so we actually looked at Latina, Latino students who were enrolled in a Chicano studies program in a Western state in the US. This institution is a highly selective institution, and I think that's really important, again, when I talked about institutional capacity. When we sampled, the sample that we ended up choosing to be participants, we ended up having 14 total. 12 of the 14 were Mexican Americans, one was a Chilean, and one was a Salvadorian. Interesting enough, 12 were employed through work study. 2 were also employed in off-campus employment, and 1 was employed on an on-campus job. And 11 of the 14 worked 10 to 20 hours a week. And so I think I also want to demonstrate how I'm really giving you more detail in terms of the work, right? Which is, again, like I mentioned, a gap in the higher education research. The other thing, too, with our sample is that we began to notice the backgrounds and the lived experiences of these students. So I don't have it up here, but I can definitely share that with you. I can send you the actual study if you'd like. But I just wanted to tell you about their background. So most of them, their parents worked in blue-collar jobs. In particular, one had a parent who worked in the fields. Another one had a parent who was a cafeteria worker, housekeeper, painter, bus driver. And so these very blue-collar jobs that their parents worked to support them and have a life. And we began to see how that actually played out in terms of the way that they made meaning about work. Okay. The other way that we did data collection, just, I'll go over this because you probably know this kind of stuff, but semi-structured interviews, this was part of a broader study where we were looking at actually initially how Chicano studies influence success, but we began to see this pattern in terms of working. The analysis, because it was qualitative, we did take part in verbatim transcriptions, but also interpretive analytics, as well as validity checks. And so we worked a lot with our participants, and I think that's important when you're working with underrepresented students. So let me tell you the findings that we came up with. And it was really interesting because I will let you know that I probably came into this study, even though myself, I am a Latina, and probably reflect a lot of the background of these participants. I still came in with the assumption that based on what we hear so much about work, that they were gonna say, oh, work is horrible. It's not contributing to my success. I wish I didn't do it. But we began to find 3 distinct patterns that kind of pushed against that normative. And so the first theme that we came to find is this idea of bringing familial orientation towards work. And so our students, because of the backgrounds that I mentioned to you a minute ago of their parents, they began to describe that their parents encouraged them to pursue higher education to go beyond their family status. So the quote that I'm going to read to you here is from Juan, and he said, "Since kindergarten, my parents told me, you have to study because you don't want to work like us, because it's really hard. It is really a pain. So ever since then, my parents told me, you have to go to college because you don't want to end up like us. That is why we came to this country, so you could have a better future. Otherwise, what is the point?" So very poignant discussions about going beyond the socioeconomic status that the family is currently at, which tends to be lower socioeconomic status. There was another participant in our study who described how his uncle would drive him past the fields where the migrant workers were working and would tell him, you know, if you don't do well in college, this summer, you're gonna work with me in the fields. And so the student, you know, laughed when he said that because he basically said, you know, I don't want to do that. And it's not that they were putting down their family's work, but they were using it as a way to uplift their family and continue persisting and looking to do success in terms of higher education. Okay. I think another important part, again, is, as I mentioned ago, see how the students began to make meaning of what work means to them in terms of their families. And so this blue collar, hard labor, out in the fields idea of work. The second theme that we found in our research was that our participants, through their participation in work on campus or off campus or through the university, they began to develop skills and community. This was really interesting for me because they noted that work actually exposed them to new knowledge, skill development, and engagement. And so here's a quote that kind of represents this theme here, and it's by Reina. And Reina said, "I'm interacting more at the store, like with more people my age. I've made another friend these past 2 days when I was working. I used to see her and would think, oh my God, she seems kind of conceited or something. She's a great person and like really funny. I'm so glad like now I'm meeting more people at the store. It's kind of fun and I like working with other students." And so as first generation college students, we began to see this idea of engagement, right? So we always talk about how do we engage students more, engage them, because that will lead to success. But first generation college students, depending on the campus that they're at, they may be a minoritized population and not know the questions to ask or what to do. And so what we began to see in terms of this theme is how work connected them to these opportunities to engage and find friends. You know, even if it was a job that was seen as maybe to some not that, you know, how can someone actually get something from working at the on-campus bookstore, which is where Reina worked. They also were talking about how, you know, working at the museum or working as an RA led them to build more capital because they could then interact with folks who were in the student affairs areas that maybe when they got into they were unsure about something, they could go to that RA or their supervisor and ask them for support and help. So this was a really interesting finding from our sample. The third and final theme that we found in our study was the theme of finding work to be satisfying. And so our students expressed that their work experiences during college helped them to envision what finding more fulfilling work would be like. This was a salient finding from our study, mainly because the students were saying that although it's work, and this idea of how work pulls you away, the work was actually helping them to redefine what they've previously thought about work and see that, oh wait, you mean you don't have to work in a hot environment out, you know, you can actually be in an air-conditioned setting and you can actually do work that you really love, not work that you have to do for economics alone. And so Diana, our participant here, described this theme pretty well by saying, the children there, they look up to me. And by the way, Diana was doing a work study position off campus where she taught students in the community. So basically a teacher, she was kind of a teacher. So she said, The children there, they look up to me. They see, oh wow, she's a student at State. I want to be like her, kind of thing. You know, they ask me a lot of questions, and that kind of makes me feel better about myself, obviously as a student. And this has made me think about considering education, you know, teaching and stuff like that, because they tell me themselves that I teach them better than their own teachers. So really good example of how she began to connect the opportunities that work was offering her as a teaching assistant at an elementary school in her community surrounding State University. How now, all of a sudden, I was thinking about doing biology, but you know what? I really love teaching. And so she actually did switch to education. So taking the big takeaways from this particular study and this idea of what we found, I think, you know, again, I want to talk about the limitations of it. It is a qualitative study, so we can't generalize, right, to everybody. But I think there are some big takeaways that we find from it, and it's suggestive. But the first here is that we have to begin to understand how students make meaning of work, because that's going to be important. Again, they demystified my own assumptions about this idea about how work could enhance or influence the success of an underrepresented student group in higher education. We also believe that our study begins to suggest that the influence of the institution. And I'm a big proponent of this in my own research, just in all my lines, but the institution itself has a role in the opportunity that work can provide. And honestly, it has an opportunity, has a role in general. But in terms of work, what do we know about the institution? So much of the research focuses on the student. What did the student know? What did they not know? And when you think about Latina and Latinos who are first generation, how do they even know what to ask? And how do they know what the norms of the academy are? I think you have a presentation coming up about hidden curriculum. I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? But how does that role facilitate these work opportunities? Are they taking advantage of the capital that they have, the institutional capital that they have, or don't? I think it says a lot, one way or another. Taking that point, though, with the idea of how students make meaning of work, I created this slide to begin reinforce this idea of what we're talking about and the institution class. So I'm using, again, Bourdieu's social reproduction theory. But this kind of talks about how students began to make that meaning and go through the action. So when I talk about field in terms of this theoretical framework is, what are the rules of engagement? What does everybody say is that norm? What is everybody saying that we all should do? So again, thinking about the literature, it tends to give the assumption that work is bad, that we shouldn't, do work. But if we're thinking about Latina and Latinos, especially first generation underrepresented, you're always going to rely on what you know. So going back to your socialization, how do you make meaning, but also think about how to navigate those rules of engagement? That's ultimately going to create the action. And so a specific example, thinking about this in terms of the work with Latina and Latino students, we know that college is expensive and it requires a lot of sources of funding. And so a student then will rely on what they know in terms of work. So I'll give my own personal example of this. So I worked 3 jobs while attending undergraduate school. I was the first in my family to go to school, coming from a low-income family. And so when I was navigating college, I relied on what I knew. And so I reached out to my cousins who had jobs at the local mall to then get a position at Foot Locker. And not knowing how the short term or the long term would influence that, I stayed there because they worked with my schedule. But if somebody from the outside might look at that, it's like, well, how does working at Foot Locker contribute to your long-term success? I don't know. but I think that's how we need to start thinking about things, about how students how the field says you should or shouldn't do things, and also those barriers that we put into place regardless of your background, and how you rely on what you know will dictate the action that you do in terms of student success. So a third suggestion from our study is that we believe that this does suggest that work can provide learning opportunities for underrepresented students like Latina and Latinos, but it has to be done well. There has to be quality in the job and value seen by those participants. So an example from our study that I didn't show you in terms of the themes, but a student actually had a job, 2 jobs. The student that had 2 jobs, he worked at an alumni center where, for whatever reason, the job was for him to set up the tables, just like right here, when alumni donors came in. And he also had to serve them water, serve them cookies. But he also had a job, again, working in a school, actually the YMCA. He worked in the YMCA. So in the community around Latina, Latinos, working on community development engagement. And so in his discussion to us, he talked about how, yes, both of them provided economic gain, but he really hated the alumni job. And the reason why that he hated the alumni donor job is because for him, it provided less value in terms of community uplift. He really didn't see how that benefited him. Now, one could look at that and say, wait a minute, you have access to alums? You know, what if it's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company? But to him, it wasn't what he valued. And so that's one, way to think about how work can provide learning, but it needs to also take into account what students value. Another extreme example, which unfortunately this student participant didn't make our study. Anne-Marie and I had a hard time excluding this particular student from our sample, but he was undocumented. And so he was what we found initially in the first parts of our manuscript was the outlier in terms of work. So he did not have the opportunities because he could not he was not eligible for federal financial aid. He was very limited on aid in general, but he was attending college. And so the way that he was paying for it was he was taking outside opportunities. One of his major sources of income was actually working as a handyman for one of the community members there. And what was so poignant about his discussion about work was he actually described it as this. It's like working as a machine. I'm a robot every day because I have to work 50 to 60 hours a week just to pay for tuition and survive. And so again, this idea of how work can provide learning opportunities for underrepresented students goes beyond just, Latina, Latinos into other underrepresented minoritized groups. Unfortunately, he didn't make our sample in this study, but I wanted to bring him up. And so that it's also that point right there that the work opportunities have to be flexible and meaningful to our students. So I always frame things in terms of policy. I do have a policy background, believe it or not. And so I always want to look at what I do in terms of policy implications. And so again, qualitative, but I do think this speaks to a couple of things with regard to policy. It's speaking to this idea of financial aid. So how are we packaging our students when they come here, especially those that have high need, that are first generation and may need other sources of support beyond economic gain? I think there's opportunity here in terms of student affairs practitioners, but also policymakers who are in charge of college financial aid. This point right here is actually very timely right now because we know that the federal government is discussing about decreasing the federal work study program. And so that would mean many things for many students, especially those who are underrepresented. And one of the reasons that they discuss in these policy discussions is that it's not benefiting. There is no benefit to work study. This study counters that narrative in terms of how it can help for underrepresented students. And really timely discussion right now with the current federal administration. I also believe this speaks to appropriations funding, and this is mainly specific to state policy. So coming from Texas and the state policy, I think it mirrors Wisconsin a little bit, but who is getting what? So the way that we dole out appropriations in the state of Texas is it's focused on student success metrics. So again, is institution A meeting the 6-year graduation rate versus institution B? What you'll find is that you begin to stratify the institutions, and you begin to see those that are serving larger populations of minority students and higher need students, also throw in their first generation, lower income, that they tend to get less appropriation fundings because of those static metrics that we tend to use. And so the pot to give more financial aid and work study opportunities, it's not available in schools that have larger populations serving this group of students. And so again, speaking to the institutional capacity, I think it's really important that that gets brought up. And then overall, college affordability. So again, scholars like Sarah Goldrick-Robb have talked about this, about college affordability beyond tuition and fees. When we think about Latina and Latinos in higher education, we need to go beyond just thinking about what are the costs in terms of dollars and cents with tuition. If I mentioned, as I mentioned about Latinos, Latinos having these other financial concerns that go beyond that, I think this kind of work begins to speak to why work opportunities could be beneficial in terms of affording college. Where are we going with future work in this area? It's actually, this has sparked a lot of interest. Really, it was just a pet project of ours, if I'm being honest. And we began to see, once we dug into the literature, just the large gap that's there. Where we're going with this is we're actually looking at other institutional settings. So we currently have a work in progress where we're looking at how students make meaning of work and how work contributes to student success for underrepresented students, in particular at Hispanic serving institutions. Again, taking into the capacity that these institutions can or cannot do in terms of working. The other is we're gonna look at other minoritized groups, but of course there's many out there. So I encourage you all to feel free to research in this area that we're focusing in with ties to work. Specifically, I'm looking at student veterans, because again, going back to Military City, USA. But my colleague, Anne-Marie, is also looking at this in terms of science programs too, where are minoritized students in terms of science. That also leads us to the third point that we're doing with this future work, is looking at how work can influence the professional identity and skill development, specifically for us in STEM. We're receiving a lot of calls about this because, as some of you may or may not know, this is the big area of the research right now, where there's a call to increase the STEM pipeline, but attach it to professional identity and skill development. And so how does working like the work that at the center does here in terms of internships, how does that play out in terms of workforce opportunities and gains, or not too? So I'm gonna end right there. I'm gonna leave my information up here as we talk, but I wanna leave it open for questions and discussions, feedback. I'm also full transparency, so feel free to ask me anything with this work. So, thank you. Yes?
I'm looking at it.
Yes, Community College District.
That there's
Mm-hmm.
Palo Alto College.
Yes.
I'm curious if you could go back
Yes.
to your map.
Yes.
Distress 0 to
I love my
I'm
map,
curious,
yes. Ah,
Within
Go to
the
this
0
one.
to 100,
for the community colleges?
yeah.
So I can tell you exactly where they are. So the specific community college, Palo Alto Community College, and just to give some credit to Palo Alto, because we're also just Facebook Living, and I think many of my Texas institutions are possibly going to watch this later. But one of the things that I think I tend to focus, so I'm going to answer your question, but also a little bit more broadly. I tend to focus a lot on this work in terms of my home community, mainly because, as I mentioned, San Antonio mirrors the way that the nation is going demographically. But that also means, as this map shows, that there are hiccups along that way in terms of demographic sprawl. And where education plays into that, as I mentioned, is this idea of geography of opportunity, right? So to answer your question, Palo Alto is located in this region. And one of the reasons why Palo Alto was created was because for many years before it was created, there was no access to post-secondary education for we call the south side of San Antonio. And that four-year university that I mentioned that just began actually is also here because of the same reason. So they, yes, luckily we now have the 2-year, and I think if I recall, and maybe they'll chime in, but I want to say that Palo Alto began in the 70s. I really think so, but I could be wrong on that. Somebody can check that out. But again, I mean, that's not that long ago. And the cities, we've been around for many, many years. We're actually celebrating, I actually know this, we're celebrating our tricentennial coming up. And so we have a lot of things that we're doing in the city. But in terms of education, this idea of who has access is a popular conversation because it's always been an issue with us. And so the community in the South Side is predominantly Latina, Latino. And so we were able to have, again, how this ties to policy, but policymakers from the Southside community, particularly the municipal government in these areas, well, senators representing this district of the city of San Antonio, were actually the ones who fought for these institutions. So that's Palo Alto. The oldest community college is located in this red region, San Antonio College, which if anybody knows about the history of community colleges, you know that at one time there were junior colleges. And so San Antonio College was the junior college for the University of Texas at Austin. And so they've been here a while. They're also the largest, or one of the largest. I think they have some competition now with the other ones. But they serve I think it's 30,000 students. And because they are central, they have students coming from all in. You also have, on the east side of San Antonio, St. Philip's College. And St. Philip's College, interesting enough, is the only community college that has the designation of not only being a historically Black college, but it's also a Hispanic serving institution. So really interesting if anybody's doing work in the area of minority serving institutions. We have one of the only colleges that has that double designation. So just think demographics, right? It's all demographics. And so the other thing too, so we also, one of the newer ones is located here. That's called Northwest Vista. And then we also have another new college located in this region, not the green, but around here. Northwest Vista and Northeast Lakeview, I saved them for last because they're the younger of the colleges, but they also, Northwest Vista is the, I believe it has it receives the largest, it's enrolled so many so fast. It has that designation for being that in the community college world. But it's because, going back to Military City, it's located by two bases. Northwest Vista serves the Lackland Air Force Base area, and Northeast Lakeview serves the Randolph Air Force Base area. And I know, for those of you not familiar with military, these are large military installations. I mean, large. So this is the population that's coming into our community. So that's where they're all located. And a lot of this discussion, though, because the way funding works for community college, too, is on housing prices, right? So again, looking at this map, yeah. So stratification of institutions, even in community college realms. Mm-hmm.
One other thought I had, and that is George Koo wrote a book in '05 and 2010 about student success in college, and it's one of the few books.
Yes.
The importance of that.
Yes, we definitely turn to that. We also turn to the work, because we started there, right? We started there. We also started with Aston, too. And the thing about Aston, though, is, he did, or no, I'm sorry, not Aston, but no, it was, yes. He did his first one, and then I think he did a second one on, the title escapes me right now, but it's a major book that we all have to read. But he talked about work in that first one, and then in the second one, he mentioned, I think, that the times have changed, right? And so we know that's important, but we don't know how. And that's kind of where we picked up. It's like, okay, so how is work playing into the current economics, but also the current way that higher education works and is funded, so on and so forth. Changing perspectives that I think we tend to forget. We tend to just go with what has been done since the 70s in our field and not think about the contemporary context of does that still stand, So, yes, Matt, right.
Westerner almost now.
Yes,
you might
I feel it.
consider Milwaukee as a case.
Take some notes. Yes.
And I suppose gentrification in the Milwaukee setting has urbanism kind of escalated the segregation, even now happening more and more. So you would hope that those things would change since the 60s. They're getting worse. So anyway, maybe think about that contrast. But I really loved your work, and I did a study, like an ethnographic study of low-income students. I at some different campuses, and we spent time with them sort of as they came onto campus, and then we spent the next year. And one of the things, and this totally reflects what you were saying, one of the things is that all of these students were working day one of college, right?
Yeah.
They were working before they came to their new campus community, and they were already working. And what happens is that they either, they were working through high school in a service industry, they relocate to the local McDonald's.
Right.
Like that. Or they come onto campus and they're sort of directed immediately through advising, through the TRIO programs, and through people who are well-meaning, but they're directed into low-skill campus service industry,
Right.
so custodial, cafeteria, and so on. And so something like a flagship university has institutional capacity to help those students, but because of almost like an institutional habitus or a culture on
Yes.
campus, this would be different from a community college or an access four-year college. Students, when they come to a flagship, are really encouraged not to work if they can afford not to. Minoritized students in that setting are really minoritized. So there's this, I would encourage you to think about institutional capacity also in terms of institutional culture.
Yes.
So capacity is great, but it might not be utilized in ways because of sort of the culture of campus. So I know that there can be faculty who could try and grab those students and get them into their lab before, but they're already in these jobs that are sort of low skill, high labor, exhausting, and not pre-professional before they come to campus,
Right.
or when they come to campus. I didn't have a student who could delay my studies. I didn't have a student who would delay. Also, your insight about the fact that they're in a state of open reciprocity with their families, financially also, right?
Yes.
So this is something that totally goes against the kind of majoritarian assumptions of the financial aid system. Quite obviously, FAFSA is based on a white middle class assumption of the relationship between a college student and their family, right? So it's I think that you're talking about policy implications in terms of financial aid. Anything we can do to unpack the basic majoritarian assumptions of the whole system. I think like what we need to do if we want to like experiences to the policymakers.
Agreed.
You know, I loved your work. I thought it was really,
Thank you.
learned a lot, and it kind of reflects just a lot of what I've learned about student work. I guess one thing I don't know if this is, maybe I could ask a question then. So
Yeah,
like,
sure.
but,
Sure, it's your
yeah,
event, so,
so I guess there's the idea of like, well, even these low skilled jobs that like low income students can find themselves like sort of directed into. Idea on campus that, well, let's have students like get these skills for like talking about that in terms of like, okay, time management, or I'm not, you know, like really this low skilled job, you know, they're sort of being encouraged to talk about that in terms of the skills.
right.
I sort of view that as wrong-headed. That really like the more basic problem is, you know, siphoned into these low skilled jobs.
Yeah, I think, you know, so thank you for all that. There's definitely scholars who are going in that area of institutional habitus, specific to the Hispanic serving institution. Work from my colleague Gina Garcia, who's at the University of Pittsburgh. She's actually looking at how the institution and the way that they define success for students, how is that working out? But she hasn't looked at it in terms of work, so maybe there's something, we collaborate, so maybe that's one we collaborate on. But I completely agree about what is the way that the institution even sees that. Because I think for me that's what why I put this map here, you know, about talking about what I see on a day-to-day in terms of the students that we serve at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Because to your point, we're always being told you should be like this institution, you should be like that institution, but does that work for the students that we're serving? I mean, that's a legitimate question that we have, and especially if we're now getting into this idea of what is legitimate. Regimes, you know, with ranking. Now we're getting into like ideas of neoliberalism, which again, there's scholars in that area like Dr. Leslie Gonzalez, who's at Michigan State, focusing on that. How are we shifting when we have mission drift, right? But there's a lot of work, as you can see, you can start looking at it to be done in terms of that working college student or the characteristics of the students that are coming to our campuses, because it's not that typical student that we tend to create our persistence models using, of a student who's going full time, of a student who is this 18 to 24, no familial, you know, ties, I guess, you know, or at least they're allowed to go just do school. That's your job, right? That's not the students that I see, and you know, I think, you know, there's a book too that talks about regional institutions, and we know that schools like the one that I'm at, 70% of the population is at those schools. So like you mentioned, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, I mean, that's a regional campus, right? That's who they're serving. And so I hope you all, you know, will join me in my pursuit to begin to not only reframe labor, but reframe the way that we think about serving underrepresented students. So I guess I'll stop there. That's a good mic drop, right?
Thank you all for coming. And there's lots of refreshments in the back. Please help yourself. And Matt here has a sign-up sheet if you'd like to receive some information about future seminars and lectures and events of our center. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.